From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We may not believe that we are invading and occupying countries, but the people on the other end view themselves as being invaded and occupied. So to some degree, to some measurable degree, in places like Afghanistan, increasing the U.S. presence actually increases the dimensions of the problem.
Retired U.S. Army Colonel Andrew Bacevich testifying before Congress. His son was killed 2 years ago Wednesday while serving in Iraq. He'll join us today to talk about President Obama's escalation of the war in Afghanistan in the wake of a U.S. airstrike that killed more than 100 civilians. Then Saturday was National Train Day. We'll take a look at the role of the Pullman Porters they played in African-American history.
Throughout the long days of the Civil Rights Movement, the Pullman Porters played several key roles the same way they did in Montgomery. They had had a long battle to take on the Pullman Company and start a union, and they shared the lessons they had learned in taking on one of the most powerful white companies in America.
Today, the Pullman Porters and their leader, A. Philip Randolph. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Sri Lanka, at least 430 civilians, including 100 children, have died after the Sri Lankan military shelled a civilian area under the control of the Tamil Tigers. But the actual death toll may be far higher. A pro-Tamil Tiger website estimates 3,200 civilians have died in what was the heaviest attack in the military's attempt to eliminate the separatist group. Doctors say at least 1,100 people have been injured. The United Nations described the scene as a bloodbath. Doctors and priests working inside the civilian area blame the attack on the Sri Lankan military. One Catholic priest inside the war zone said, quote, "They're fighting civilians. They're using cluster bombs, cannons. They're shooting towards people." But the Sri Lankan government accused the Tamil Tigers of shelling their own civilians. Sri Lanka's banned all journalists and international organizations from the conflict zone. On Sunday, the Sri Lankan government deported 3 British journalists after they'd reported on conditions in government-run refugee camps. A coalition of international human rights groups have called for the UN Security Council to urgently hold talks on the conflict. The U.S.-Iranian journalist Roxana Saberi will reportedly be set free later today after an Iranian court reduced her prison term to a 2-year suspended sentence. Once released, Saberi is expected to be allowed to leave Iran. Saberi was sentenced last month to 8 years in prison after being convicted in a secret trial of spying for the United States. The nation's unemployment rate has reached 8.9%, the highest in 26 years. 539,000 workers lost their jobs in April. The current unemployment rate would jump to nearly 16% if it included laid-off workers who've given up looking for new jobs or have had to settle for part-time work. African-American workers remain the hardest hit by the economic crisis. The official black unemployment rate is now 15%, but economists estimate the actual rate is closer to 27%. Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner attempted to put a somewhat positive spin on the latest unemployment numbers.
They're encouraging in some sense because the rate of decline in the economy as a whole is slowing. You're seeing some signs of stability. But these are enormously large numbers. You know, you had more than 500,000 Americans lose their jobs again. And it just underscores the fact that the economy as a whole is still going through a very challenging period. The
United Nations estimating at least 360,000 people have fled heavy fighting in northwest Pakistan, causing the largest displacement crisis in Pakistan's history. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees projects there will soon be 1 million internally displaced persons in Pakistan. The refugees are fleeing the Swat Valley, where the Pakistani military claims it's killed 700 Taliban militants in recent days. President Obama's National Security Advisor General James Jones said Sunday the U.S. will continue carrying out airstrikes in Afghanistan, despite criticism from the Afghan government. During an interview on Meet the Press, Afghan President Hamid Karzai said the strikes are undermining U.S. efforts in Afghanistan.
Our villages are not where the terrorists are. And that's what we kept telling the U.S. administration, that the war on terrorism is not in the Afghan villages, not in the Afghan homes. Respect that. Civilian casualties are undermining support in the Afghan people for the war on terrorism, and for the relations with America. How can you expect a people who keep losing their children to remain friendly?
Meanwhile, U.S. and NATO forces have been accused of using white phosphorus munitions in Afghanistan. In one incident reported by Human Rights Watch, an 8-year-old Afghan girl was severely burned by white phosphorus in March. Her father said NATO forces had fired the rounds that caused her injuries. A federal jury in Montana has acquitted chemical company W.R. Grace and 3 of its executives on all counts for knowingly exposing residents of Libby, Montana, to asbestos poisoning. An estimated 1,200 residents of Libby have died or developed cancer or lung disease from exposure to asbestos containing ore from a mine in the town. Community activist Gayla Benefield said, quote, "They've gotten away with murder again, and that's just the way it will always be." Shares of W.R. Grace rose 36% on the news of the acquittal. Visit democracynow.org for our recent coverage of the trial while we were in Montana. A group of doctors, hospitals, drug makers, and insurance companies are offering to help slow the explosive growth of health care spending over the next decade. The voluntary pledge doesn't aim at cutting health care spending overall, but merely restraining its rate of growth. In a letter to President Obama, the health care providers said they would reduce costs by simplifying administrative costs, making hospitals more efficient, reducing hospitalizations, managing chronic illnesses more effectively, and improving health care information technology. The voluntary cuts are being offered in an effort to stave off new government price constraints that might be imposed by Congress. According to the White House, the plan could save $2 trillion over the next decade. The trade groups making the pledge include the American Medical Association, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, the American Hospital Association, America's Health Insurance Plans, and the Service Employees International Union. The Obama administration said on Friday it'll keep a Bush-era rule that plays down the link between the threatened status of the polar bear and climate change. Conservation and environmental groups criticized the Interior Department's decision. Bill Snape of the Center for Biological Diversity said, quote, "The special rule is a death warrant for the polar bear. With its sea ice habitat rapidly disappearing, the polar bear needs the full protection of the Endangered Species Act." Alaska Governor Sarah Palin hailed the Obama administration's decision as a clear victory for Alaska because it removes the link between bear protection and climate change and should help North Slope oil and gas development. The publication Aviation Week reports the Pentagon's requesting a record $50 billion for its secret black budget. This marks a 3% increase over last year's total. The Pentagon budget for secret operations is now larger than the entire military budget of Britain, France, or Japan. In his weekly radio address, President Obama called on Congress to pass a credit card holders' Bill of Rights that could impose tighter regulation on the credit card industry.
Americans know that they have a responsibility to live within their means and pay what they owe. But they also have a right not to get ripped off by the sudden rate hikes, unfair penalties, and hidden fees that have become all too common in our credit card industry. You shouldn't have to fear that any new credit card is going to come with strings attached, nor should you need a magnifying glass and a reference book to read a credit card application. And the abuses in our credit card industry have only multiplied in the midst of this recession, when Americans can least afford to bear an extra burden.
The Israeli government and settler organizations are secretly working to surround East Jerusalem with 9 national parks, pathways, and sites, drastically altering the geography of the city and to strengthen Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Israel captured East Jerusalem in 1967 and later annexed it, a move not recognized by the international community. The Guardian newspaper reports under an 8-year plan, a series of 9 national parks, trails, and tourist sites based on apparent Jewish historical spots would be established, most under the control of settler groups working together with the Israeli government. These sites would also create a link to Jewish settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Both Israelis and Palestinians claim Jerusalem as their capital. The Israeli organization Peace Now says the secret plan for East Jerusalem might prevent the ability to reach a 2-state solution. In other news from the Middle East, President Obama's renewed economic and diplomatic sanctions against Syria. The sanctions were first put in place by President Bush 4 years ago.